The brief prayer. Our loving and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you because you not only created this vast and beautiful universe, but you still control it. We thank you for your promise that you will no longer remember the sins that we have confessed and renounced. We're grateful to you for having given us free access to your presence through our mediator, Jesus Christ. If we suffer physical pain or material loss in this world, we're glad to know that they're nothing when compared with the glories of heaven. Enable us not to value the transitory more than the permanent, the cardinal over the spiritual, and help us to live by faith. And may unselfish love govern all our interpersonal relationships. Be with us throughout this Bible study. Give us the same wisdom and understanding that you granted to Daniel the prophet in all times, so that we'll be able to understand the prophecies, the mysteries, and the revelations that are recorded for us in the Bible. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Since we're dealing with the time of the end, I thought of discussing some of the prophecies that relate to the time of the end. And there are three major prophecies, or four, I would say, that are tightly connected to the events of end time. The three of them are found in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8. And the fourth one is in Revelation chapter 17. Today, we will take up the study of Daniel chapter 2. So if you have your Bibles with you, you can follow through as I try to explain to you the prophecy recorded in Daniel chapter 2. These Bible prophecies are important confidence builders because they tell us how the prophets and the apostles, through special divine revelation, were able to know what would happen later on. And history verifies the accuracy of Bible prophecy, as you will find out today. Now, Daniel chapter 2 deals with the major non-Jewish or Gentile empires that ruled over the then known world. These empires had full sway, full control over the then known civilized world. Now, when we go to Daniel chapter 2, we discover that King Nebuchadnezzar had established the Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar was not only the most famous emperor of Babylon, he was the founder of the Babylonian Empire. Almost all historians regard him as the founder of the Babylonian Empire. If it were not for King Nebuchadnezzar, there would not have been a Babylonian Empire. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, as you know, invaded Judah, the county of Judah, and destroyed the capital city, Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, which King Solomon had built, and took many Jews captives to Babylon. Actually, the Assyrians invaded the land of Israel before the Babylonians, and the Assyrians had taken Jewish captives from northern Israel and took them to Assyria, and then later on Babylon defeated Assyria, and the Israelite captives that had been taken to Assyria by the Assyrians became captives in Babylon. Okay, so that's a kind of a background material for you. Babylon is important because I said had major dealings with the people of God at that time, the Jewish people. When I say the kingdom of Judah, you have to understand that it's the southern kingdom. After King Solomon's death, the united kingdom of Israel was divided into two parts. 10 tribes broke away and they formed the country of Israel in the north, all the way from north of Jerusalem. The territory from north of Jerusalem to the Lebanese border was called the Kingdom of Israel, and its capital was Samaria. Then south of that was called the Kingdom of Judah. The Kingdom of Judah belonged to two tribes, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. The capital of the Kingdom of Judah was Jerusalem. So when we say Judah, we mean the southern kingdom, not the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was destroyed before the southern kingdom. In 612 before Christ, the Assyrians invaded northern Israel, and they destroyed the kingdom of Israel and took many Israelites captive to Assyria. Now the kingdom of Judah was destroyed in 586 before Christ by the Babylonians. So these two dates are very important. 612 was when the kingdom of northern Israel, the kingdom of Israel in the north, was destroyed by the Assyrians. 586 BC is when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple. You know, in the BC period, the numbers go down. You start from an upper number, then you go down until you reach 0. Okay, and from AD, the numbers go up. But from BC, you start from a higher number and keep going downward. So you find out how the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was destroyed in 1612 BC by the Assyrians. That was before the kingdom of Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And both of these kingdoms were destroyed because the people of Israel had rebelled against God, or they had forsaken the true God and gone after the worship of false gods like Baal and Ashtaroth, for example. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, we find that Daniel and 3 of his companions were in Babylon. They had been exiled to Babylon in 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar had a way of selecting the brightest young people from among the exiles. And he chose Daniel and his 3 companions because they were young, they were bright, they were intelligent. And he sent them to what I call Nebuchadnezzar's University to be trained, to acquire knowledge and education so that later on they could serve the Babylonian Empire in high positions. And Nebuchadnezzar changed their names. Daniel's name was not changed, but Daniel, the companions of Daniel, they were called, like one was called Hananiah. His name was changed to Shadrach, which was a Babylonian name. Hananiah is a Jewish name, meaning the mercy of God. uh, uh, Mishael was called Meshach, and the other one, Azariah, was called Abednego. Abednego means the servant of Nego, another Babylonian god. You see how he tried to change, by changing their names from Jewish names to Babylonian names, he tried to assimilate them into the Babylonian culture. And so I would say they graduated with flying colors from Nebuchadnezzar's university, and they were appointed, they were given high positions within the empire. The Babylonian emperors retained at their palace a number of so-called wise men. And who were these wise men? They were the counselors of the emperor. The wise men included magicians, sorcerers, astrologers, and highly educated people. So this wise men consisted of an assortment of people. Some of them were magicians and sorcerers, others were astrologers, and some were highly educated people. These served as counselors to the emperor. In Daniel chapter 2, we read that Nebuchadnezzar one night had a strange dream that startled him. He woke up, but then he claimed that he had forgotten the dream. He didn't know what he had seen. But the Bible tells us in Daniel chapter 2 that the dream troubled the king, caused him a great deal of anxiety. But by morning, he couldn't remember the details of the dream. So he called the wise men. He called the wise men and told them, you have to tell me the dream that I saw and then interpret it. And the wise men say, no king had ever made such a request. This is a difficult thing. They tell the king Nebuchadnezzar, tell us the dream, we will interpret it. And Nebuchadnezzar says, if you are wise men, if you are magicians and astrologers and sorcerers, and you claim to know secret things, things that would happen in the future, then you should be able to tell me the dream that I had seen. They are unable to do that. They keep telling him, tell us the dream, we'll interpret it for you. And then Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree to have all these wise men executed. It's at that time, it looks like Daniel was not with these wise men. He was in a separate place. He hears about this decree and he goes to see the captain of the palace guard. His name was Arioch. He meets him and tells him, why is it that the king issued such a decree? And Arioch tells him what had transpired, and Daniel says, give me time. I and my friends will pray, and we will be able to reveal to the king the dream that he had seen and interpret for him. And Arioch says, fine, he agrees to this proposition. Now, Daniel and his three friends immediately approach God through the avenue of prayer. They have a prayer meeting. They knew that their lives were at stake. If they failed to tell the king the dream that he had seen, they would be executed with the other wise men. So their lives were in danger. They prayed and asked God to reveal to them the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had seen, and through a special revelation, divine revelation, Daniel gets to know what the details of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So he goes to the palace, to the captain of the palace guard, Arioch, and tells him, I know what I can tell the king all the details of the dream that he had seen, and I can interpret it for him. And Arioch takes him to the palace, introduces him to the king. Now, Daniel gives credit to God. It's interesting. He tells King Nebuchadnezzar, God is the one who sets up kings and deposes them. He has knowledge. He gives knowledge and discerning to those who obey him and love him. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar, the king of heaven revealed to me the dream that you had seen. And now he begins narrating the dream. He says, O king, while you were sleeping in your bed, you saw a great statue, a huge statue. And this statue was different from all other statues because it was composed of different metals. He said this statue had a head made of solid gold. And he tells, now he goes to the interpretation and he says, O king, you are that golden head. You are the head of gold. And you can see how Nebuchadnezzar's ego got inflated. He became proud. Oh, I am the head of gold. That's great. But then comes the disturbing news. Daniel tells him, your kingdom will be replaced by another kingdom, which is inferior to you. And he says, as you saw the statue, the arms and the chest of this image were made of silver, and a kingdom inferior to you will replace you. This doesn't sit well with Nebuchadnezzar. He thought his kingdom would last forever. And now Daniel tells him that his kingdom would be replaced by another kingdom, which is inferior to you. And Daniel interprets it. He says this: the silver kingdom is the kingdom of Media and Persia. You see, the statue has two arms. One of them represents Media, the other one represents Persia. The Medes and the Persians were two different people. But the Medes were more prominent than the Persians at the start. Cyrus the Great was able to unify the Medes and the Persians together in one empire because of his family, because of this family composition. His mother, the mother of Cyrus the Great, was a Mede, and his father was a Persian. So he was half Persian, half Mede. And that's why he was able to unite the Persians and the Medes into one empire. And at that time, the Medes had the upper hand. But in due time, the Persians overpowered the Medes, and the Persians took over the empire, and the Medes became the importance of the Medes just subsided. So it started as an empire made up of two nations, the Medes and the Persians, but then ended up with the Persians gaining the upper hand. And then it first was called the Medo-Persian Empire, then it was known as the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire destroyed Babylon. It's interesting how Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon if you read the history books. Cyrus the Great led his army to Babylon, and Babylon had fortifications, had walls around the city. And Babylon had three walls built one behind the other. That if the first wall was breached, there was a second wall. If the second wall was breached, there was a third wall. So it was a well-fortified city. Instead of one wall, it had three walls built one behind the other, which gave them a sense of security. But the river Euphrates flowed from underneath a bridge that went under the fortifications of Babylon. Now Cyrus the Great came with his army. He encircled the city of Babylon and he ordered his army to dig a trench. The Babylonian defenders from top of their walls started laughing at the Persians. What are the Persians doing? Digging a trench? What for? They had no clue what the Persians were after. For months, the Persians were just digging a trench, making it deeper and deeper and deeper. Then one night when Belshazzar, this was a successor of King Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon, had a grand banquet, a grand feast. The Persian army diverted the flow of the river Euphrates to the ditch, to the canal, to the trench they had dug. And they walked over the dry riverbed of the Euphrates. You remember I told you the Euphrates flowed under the fortifications of the city, and it went through the city. So by diverting the course of the river Euphrates, the Persian army did not have to destroy the walls of Babylon, which were impregnable. They just walked over the dry riverbed of the Euphrates and surprised the Babylonian defenders, because all of a sudden the Persian soldiers were inside the city. They didn't have to knock down the walls. They didn't have to break the gates of the city. They just diverted the flow of the river Euphrates and then surprised the Babylonian defenders. All of a sudden, the Persian army was inside Babylon and they took over. That's how they conquered Babylon. It's amazing. When you read, historians say it was amazing. And I believe it was God ordained. It was God ordained that the Persians captured Babylon. Okay, so this happened in 538 BC, when Babylon fell to the Persians. Then Daniel continues interpretation. Then he says, "You, O king, you saw that this image, the statue, had a belly and thighs made of bronze. And this is a third empire that will replace the previous two." It's another thing I want to bring out to you. Babylon was the first kingdom that minted golden coins. That's why the golden head represents Babylon. And the Persian Empire was the first empire to mint silver coins. That's why it's called the Silver Empire. And the third empire that replaced the Persian Empire and the Babylonian Empire is called the Bronze Empire. It's because it represents the empire established by Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire. It's called the Bronze Empire because Alexander the Great supplied his army with bronze weapons. The weapons which Alexander's soldiers used were made of bronze. So that's why it's called the Bronze Kingdom. And Alice, I prefer the other statue. The other statue is much okay. That's all right. So in 330 BC, Alexander the Great defeats the Persians, and he had a meteoric rise. Alexander the Great. He was the son of Philip II. Philip II was the king of Macedonia, northern Greece. His father was assassinated, and then young Alexander ascended to the throne. And he, with the speed of lightning, was able to subdue all of Greece, all of Asia Minor, all of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Syria, and he marched into Persia, and he destroyed the Persian army. He destroyed the capital of Persia, which was called Persepolis. He burned it down to the ground, and he defeated the Persian army. He put an end to the Persian Empire. So Alexander the Great was a brilliant military strategist. He never lost a battle. Even when he faced larger enemies, even when he was outnumbered, he was able to defeat his enemies. He never lost a battle. He was the one who invented the phalanx. You know what the phalanx is? The formation of soldiers. The phalanx consisted of 8 lines of soldiers, and each line had 8 soldiers. So on the first line, you had 8 soldiers, the second line, 8 soldiers, the third, 8 soldiers, and so forth until you got to the 8th line, and again, you had 8 soldiers. So when the phalanx attacked, what happened? If the soldiers on the first line got killed, there were the second line. If the second line soldiers were mowed down, there was the third line. Then there was the fourth line, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th line. This was a military strategy that Alexander the Great invented, and it served him very well. The phalanx formation of his army guaranteed victory for him. And he burnt down Persepolis. Persepolis means the city of the Persians. The Persians called themselves Pars. Okay? The way we call ourselves Hai, the Persians called themselves Pars, or Parsi was the Persian. And polis means city. So Persepolis means the city of the Persians. If you go to Iran, visit a city called Shiraz, not too far from the city of Shiraz, you come across the ruins of Persepolis. The city was burned down. The palaces that had wooden roofs and wooden walls were all burnt down. What remains today are the stone columns, the stone statues, and the stone columns. Whatever was made of stone stands. Whatever was built by wood was destroyed. And Alexander the Great reached the borders of India, and that's when he died at a young age. He died at a young age because he was a heavy wine drinker. He died of liver cirrhosis, I'm sure. He loved to drink wine in large quantities. He consumed a lot of wine, and he died young because of that. Now, he had no legitimate heirs. After he died, his empire was divided among his top 4 generals. And each of these 4 generals took a slice of the empire and established a kingdom of his own. Like General Ptolemy took Egypt, and he formed the dynasty of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Seleucus, General Seleucus took Syria, and he formed the Seleucid kingdom over Syria. And General Lysimachus, he took Thrace and Asia Minor. Asia Minor is today Turkey. And General Cassander, he took Macedonia and the rest of Greece. So what was one empire now was divided into 4 kingdoms. Okay, so that's the Greek Empire. Then Daniel says, then as you looked at this statue, you saw it had legs of iron. The legs of iron represent a 4th empire that will replace the previous three empires. And this Iron Empire was Rome. Rome was the country that used iron weapons for the first time in history. And the reason there are two legs is because the Roman Empire had two branches, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire had its capital in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire had its capital at Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Okay, so that's why you have two legs. And Jesus was born during the Roman domination, during the period of Roman domination. The Roman Empire destroyed all these kingdoms established by the four Greek generals in 168 AD. Some history books say they give 2027 BC as the date for the establishment of the Roman Empire. It's because the Roman Senate at that time gave extraordinary powers to a general called Augustus. And they believe they consider Augustus to be the first Roman emperor. So they start with 27 BC. But the Roman Empire started before that, when the Roman legions defeated the four generals of Alexander. That should be regarded the beginning of Rome, which is 168 AD, 168 BC. That's when the Roman legions destroyed the kingdoms established by Alexander's four generals. I believe that should be the beginning date for the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire in the West continued to exist until 476 AD, when it was destroyed by the Germanic tribes. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued until 1453, when it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks changed the name of Constantinople to Istanbul. All right, so that's Rome. And then Daniel continues. He says, "O king, when you looked at the toes, some were made of iron, others made of clay." You know, iron and clay don't mix, right? And he told the king that some of these kingdoms would be strong as iron, others would be as weak as clay. And then Daniel says they will mingle with the seeds of men, meaning there will be intermarriages, but the 10 toes will never be united. So the united empires end with Rome. Then we are now in the time of the divided nations of Western Europe. The 10 toes represent the 10 European nations that came into existence after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, all right, which is 476 AD. And Daniel didn't stop here. He says, "O king, as you were looking at this huge statue, all of a sudden you saw a rock cut out without hands, struck the statue at the toes, and the whole statue collapsed and became a heap of rubble." Now, we know that the rock cut out without hands represents Jesus Christ. So when Jesus Christ returns, he will destroy all the kingdoms, all the earthly kingdoms, and his kingdom will displace all of them. And the only kingdom that will remain standing is Jesus' everlasting kingdom. So we're now living in the period of the toes of this statue, and we're awaiting the rock to come and smash hit the statue at the toes, destroy the whole thing, and Daniel says the kingdom of the Messiah will replace, or the kingdom of God will replace all existing human kingdoms. And the kingdom of the Messiah will grow and become a huge mountain and would endure forever. So the only kingdom that will endure forever is the kingdom of Jesus Christ. That's the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. And I find it to be very, very interesting how Daniel was able to predict all these things. In modern times, the most famous historian of the 20th century was Arnold Toynbee. He was from Britain. Arnold Toynbee is the one who recognizes the Armenian genocide. He says, "O Daniel, rejoice. The kingdom of the empire of gold, silver, bronze, and iron have all disappeared. And we are now in the period of the disunited toes." It's interesting that to have a historian of great caliber substantiating the accuracy of Daniel's prophecies, saying, "Oh, Daniel, rejoice, the empires of gold, silver, bronze, and iron that you predicted came and disappeared from the stage of world history. And now we are in the time of the toes, the divided nations of Western Europe." When you study history, you will find that there was a time when the nations of Europe almost got united through intermarriage. We know that the most famous monarch, one of the most famous queens of England, was Queen Victoria. Do you know what historians called Queen Victoria? The grandmother of most European kings and princes. Most of the European kings and princesses, most of the European kings and princes were related to Queen Victoria by intermarriage. So she was the grandmother of all European kings and princes. Daniel says that these 10 toes will intermingle with one another, but they will never get united. They intermingled through marriage relationships, but they never got united. We never had a United States of Europe. Western Europe never coalesced into one united empire. It remained divided. The European Union is collapsing. Britain pulled out of the European Union because of nationalistic pride. The British refused to have one currency. They wanted to retain their sterling pound. They wanted to retain their independence. In the European Union, the European Parliament ruled or established policies for the member countries. And Britain didn't want to be ruled by the European Parliament. They wanted to retain their independence. They wanted to have the British Parliament issuing decrees governing the future of their country. And probably other countries will follow Britain's example. That's what some people say. But anyway, the European Union is a weak union. It's a very loose union. Pardon me?
The four beasts of Revelation.
Okay, the four beasts of Revelation, they are in Daniel chapter 7. They run parallel to this statue, but we'll discuss them next week. because I guess combining the two would be too much. I first of all thought of combining the two because they run parallel. Like in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a vision, and in this vision he sees 4 wild beasts emerging out of the sea. The first one is a winged lion made of gold, and that corresponds to the Babylonian kingdom. We'll discuss Daniel chapter 7 next week. Today we covered Daniel chapter 2. I believe that's enough. If you have any questions, I'm willing to entertain them at this time.
Can you summarize on this?
But Millie, I'm sort of wondering, the feat of iron and clay. I don't know. I kept thinking there had to be some kind of an empire between the Roman Empire and modern day today. The first thought I had was the Soviet Union, which would have been, before all of that. I mean, the Soviet Union was an empire of a sort, which wielded significant influence over most of Europe, right, as well as a good chunk of Asia. And when you added on the influence of China and Korea, you had most of Asia as well as Europe covered by the by communism, if you will. I'm almost wondering why that and the manner in which it fell also kind of lends itself to the whole idea of, iron mixed with clay, because it was a strong country, but only in the way it presented itself. It was not strong in any other way.
My answer to that is simple. Daniel's vision regarding this statue, this huge image,
right,
deals with the nations that came out of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. So the Soviet Union was not one of them, or Russia was not one of them. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, 10 European nations emerged from the collapse of this empire, and Russia was not among those. So the focus of prophecy is on the 10 nations in Western Europe that came into existence after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. And history is also interesting. The Germanic tribes that invaded Rome had no intention to rule Rome. They just wanted to sack it.
right.
They wanted to plunder it. They knew that Rome, as the capital of the civilized world, had lots of wealth. There were many treasures in Rome. So they invaded Rome, killed the last Roman emperor, whose name was Romulus, and they sacked and plundered and then left.
I thought it was Honorius.
Yeah, they didn't want to rule Rome. They just sacked it and plundered it, left, and then left. But that was the end of the Roman Empire in the West.
Right.
There was no other emperor that succeeded Romulus, who was slain by the Germanic.
Well, they were right. They actually, the empire was actually ruled regionally, because you had the Byzantine Empire, which was just the eastern portion of the Roman Empire
portion, which continued until 1453.
Right.
It was destroyed by the Ottoman Turks. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you remember, Vartan actually went to the Byzantine Empire looking for help, against the Persians.
He had very close relationship or a friendship with the Byzantine emperor at the time. But when the Armenes requested his help at the Battle of Vartanants, the Byzantine emperor refused.
Right.
Refused to come to the help of the Armenians.
Of course, right.
So
We were-
there is a lesson for us. You see, we depended on Russia as our ally, and they let us down. They sold weapons to our enemy, to the Azerbaijanis,
Right.
knowing that those weapons would one day be used against the Armenians, because for the last 10 years, Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, has been threatening Armenia with war and invasion and destruction and extinction. He even claimed Yerevan belonged to them, to the Azerbaijanis. So when you have a dictator who is a warmonger, threatening a neighboring country with war, invasion, and extinction and destruction, and you sell arms to him, that's treason. And knowing that Armenia was the only nation in the Southern Caucasus that was a faithful ally of Russia. Georgia is not an ally of Russia.
No.
Azerbaijan is not an ally of Russia. The only country in the Southern Caucasus that was allied to Russia was Armenia. And they betrayed their most loyal ally and threw the Armenians under the bus, so to speak. Every Armenian has this feeling that this war, the Armenian army was not defeated. The Armenian army fought heroically. The Armenians fell victim to a vicious conspiracy that was hatched between Putin, Erdogan, and Aliyev.
And then back to the study, one of the things that you had said was that Daniel, I mean, as opposed to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And it's actually pretty funny because the person who knew which one was which better than anybody else in my Sunday school class was Tyler.
Oh.
He could recite them, which one was which, every Sunday. But one of the things that when you look up Daniel's name, he's referred to as Belteshazzar, which I think is the, if I remember correctly, the translation, it is the head person who gets revelations from a god or a deity, which is Bel, right? So he had, is Belteshazzar a name or a title that Daniel had?
It's a name. The way Daniel is a name, it's a Hebrew. Daniel in
Right.
Hebrew means God is my judge.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so that's why you see there's no reference to the Chinese Han dynasty. That was a great empire. There's no reference to the Japanese empire. There's no reference because if you follow Daniel's interpretation, the focus is on the nations that emerged after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West.
Right, but the way I look at the prophecy is that you're talking about the empires that were in that geographic area where Babylon was, and eventually it became part of Persia, then part of the Greek Empire, then part of the Roman Empire, then so on and so on.
Yeah.
So I kind of discount the Chinese and the other Asian empires simply because they did not occupy that space where Babylon was, or most of Europe was, or is.
The interesting thing, when Saddam Hussein was at the zenith of his power before his demise,
Right.
He vowed to restore the Babylonian Empire. And he started rebuilding Babylon. He built the gate of Ishtar. He reproduced it. But that was the only thing he could do. I mean, he just rebuilt the gate of the city, which was called the Gate of Ishtar. And then he lost power because of the American invasion, and he got killed. And Babylon today remains uninhabited. the Bible prophecy regarding Babylon says Babylon will never be rebuilt. Saddam Hussein wanted to rebuild it in defiance to God,
Mhm.
but God took him out of the way. Babylon has
Yeah,
not
just
been
yeah.
rebuilt. The Bible says Babylon will never be rebuilt. It will remain the habitation of Bedouins and the jackals, the wild animals.
Right.
But really, is that a prophecy? Because I was born in Baghdad. It's not a shaga. It's a city. It's a big city. It's not like what you're describing now, Babylon. I was born 1952 over there, and it's a big city. It's not like you're talking.
Baghdad is a big city. You know, I visited Iraq with some of my friends
Yeah.
in the 1960s,
Mhm.
and
Oh.
we visited the site of ancient Babylon.
Mm.
And we saw where Nebuchadnezzar's palace once stood. We saw the bricks of the palace that are destroyed, and they're stamped with the name Nebuchadnezzar. It's interesting. We saw the winged lion standing where the palace gate used to be.
Mhm.
The ruins of Babylon are outside the city of Baghdad.
Yeah.
We drove about more than an hour from Baghdad to reach the ruins of the site of ancient Babylon. And there was no city there, no sign of human habitation, except a few tents where Bedouins lived. But the place looked desolate.
How long it took you from Baghdad to go to Babylon? How long took you by car?
Over an hour, I guess.
Over when
It
we
was, it was slightly over 40 kilometers.
over an hour. We used
I
to
was
say, they used to take us when we were young, to go to Babylon in the school. But I don't remember how far was it. We were young, and it was just ruins. There wasn't
Well,
something beautiful.
Baghdad was a large, beautiful city.
Yeah.
It's no longer a pretty city like it used to be. Baghdad was a very impressive city. And I remember with my friends, we sat at a cafe at the banks of the river Tigris and to eat some food at a restaurant. They lowered the net, they caught a fish from the river Tigris, and they dressed it and cooked it for us in front of our eyes. It was as fresh as could be.
They call it Mesgoof.
They call it Masgoof, yes.
But was it the Tigris? I thought it's a Euphrates.
Well, there are two rivers that
Yeah, but
the Euphrates, and this cafe was on the banks of the Tigris River.
I thought it was
Dijla, the Arabs say Nahr Dijla.
Furat. The other one is
The other
Furat.
one is Furat. Furat is Euphrates, Dijla is Tigris.
Yeah.
Yeah, both rivers crisscross the city, the Euphrates and the Tigris.
But when I went to Turkey in Diyarbakir, it was the Tigris.
The Tigris, yeah. The Tigris River is close to Dikranagerd, which is now Diyarbakir in Turkey. Yeah.
But Badveli, as described, I don't understand the Byzantines. Are they Roman? What is it? What are they, Byzantines?
Well, they were part of the Roman Empire, but later on, the Greeks, it was taken over by the Byzantine Greeks. Most of the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire were of Greek origin. And it's in history books, it's also called Byzantium. The country is called Byzantium, but it was, and in history books, it's also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. Although the Greeks later on, most of the kings were of Greek extraction. Constantine was a Roman, but then his followers, a few hundred years after him, Justinian was a Roman, but then later on, most of the Byzantine emperors were of Greek origin. And by the way, Byzantium had 4 emperors who were of Armenian extraction.
Byzantine.
Yeah.
But even though I was hearing about the Armenian, the Byzantine wanted Vartan Mamigonian to go to there. They wanted him to change his whatever his belief, not to be Christian. Who was Vartan Mamigonian? He went there, but when he came back, he had a war. He decided to have a war with them. That's why he was defeated.
No, the Byzantines were Christian. They're Greek Orthodox. They belong to the Greek Orthodox. They belong to the Greek Orthodox Church. But the dispute between the Armenians and the Greeks over religion was regarding the nature of Christ. The Armenians were monophysites, and the Byzantines believed Jesus had two natures, divine and human, that were united but distinct. The Armenian position was that Jesus had two natures, divine and human, but these two natures got united, got mingled together, and resulted in one nature, in which the divine nature was more predominant. So those who believed this were called monophysites. The Armenians, the Copts, the Syriacs, the Ethiopians, and some Indian Christians are called monophysites. They believe Jesus had one nature. But they don't deny the human nature of Christ. They say Christ had divine nature and human nature, but when these two natures got united, got mingled together, the end result was one nature.
What was it? What was it the end? What nature was it at the end?
It was a composition of divine and human, but they said the divine nature was the prominent, the most dominant. The Greek Orthodox view and the Roman Catholic Church also has the same view, that the two natures, the human and divine natures, got united but remained distinct. They remained separate. Notice that's the theological difference. There's some nuance that you have to distinguish to comprehend. The monophysites and their opponents believe Jesus had a divine and human nature. The monophysites mean one nature, believe that these two natures formed one nature. Whereas the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics and most Protestants today say the two natures got united but remained separate. They remained distinguishable from one another. I remember in Jerusalem, I discussed this with a priest, and he told me, if you take a cup of water and you put a few drops of sugar in it, the sugar dissolves in the hot water. And then you can't separate, to you, it looks one mixture. The sugar does not look to be separate from the water because they got mingled together. And that's how they explain their position about the nature of Christ. The divine and human natures got united, they intermingled, and the end result was one nature. And this one nature was mostly divine.
And
So that was the theological difference between the Armenians and the Byzantines. And still, this is the great issue between the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Greek Church and the Roman Catholic Church.
But why Vartan Mamigonian went to war with them? Why? Why did he go? He went to war with them. They wanted him to change his, Vartan Mamigonian to change his whatever. He made himself okay, yeah. But then when he came back, it says, I heard that when he came back, he decided to invade, have a war. He pretended, okay, but
you mix two things together.
Vartan.
When Vartan was in Persia, when he went to the Persian court with the other Nakharas for consultation, the Shah of Iran
Yeah,
told them that he was holding them hostage
yeah, that's
and
just,
threw them in prison.
yeah.
Unless they converted to Zoroastrianism, they would not be released.
Oh, the Shah, then
That's when they faked a conversion to Zoroastrianism. The
Oh,
Shah sent them, rewarded them with gifts, and
uh-huh,
sent them accompanied by 500 Zoroastrian priests
uh-huh,
to reconvert Armenia to Zoroastrianism. But when they entered the Armenian village of Kochten,
mm,
the Armenians slaughtered the 500 Persian Zoroastrian priests that had come to reconvert the Armenians to Zoroastrianism. It's true that the Byzantines tried to exert a lot of influence on the Armenians to change their view about the nature of Christ and have the Armenian church and the Greek church united.
mm,
And I believe, some people say, and I believe they're true, that the Armenian church created this division. It's an artificial division
mhm,
in order to retain their independence. The Armenian church didn't want to be subject to either Rome or Byzantium. They wanted to remain independent.
mhm,
And so to be independent, they created this religious dogma to keep them separate from Rome and from Byzantium. So the Armenian church remained independent of Rome and Byzantium. To this day, the Armenian church is independent. The Armenian Apostolic Church is independent of Rome and independent of the Greek church.
Do you agree with what they did back then?
Pardon me?
Do you agree with
I believe it's an artificial division, and I believe that the difference between the two positions is not is bridgeable. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a matter of semantics.
Mhm.
It's hair splitting.
Yeah. They should have been, they should have listened to Jesus. He said you should be united. The Christians, we have to have one unity. In Christ, one unity. See, that division, it's not from God. That's
Yeah.
man-made.
I mean, the division was man-made. It was based on political considerations.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was like today, the Armenian Apostolic Church is divided into two administrative branches. Doctrinally, they're the same, but the diocese and the prelacy are separate. The diocese is under the control of Echmiadzin. The prelacy is under the control of Antilias, Cilicia, the See of Cilicia. And there are no differences in doctrine. There is no difference in beliefs. It's just a difference in administration. There was a survey done by the Armenian Mirror Spectator 10 years ago, saying that most young Armenians today want to have the diocese and the prelacy unite. They want them to be united, not divided.
Yeah.
But this hasn't occurred. Do you know why? Because the head of the diocese doesn't want to lose his power and his authority and his throne to the prelacy, and vice versa. You have two bishops who are clinging to power and they're not willing to cede power to the other one.
And what's this apostolic եղբայրակցություն? What is that one? Yeah, apostolic եղբայրակցություն.
Yeah.
It's apostolic, but what is that?
It is an imitation of the Armenian Protestant fellowship. Armenian Protestants or evangelicals, they call one another brother, sister, all right? And they meet in groups. They meet in the homes of members for Bible study and prayer. Armenian evangelicals have done this since their inception. All right. Now, the Armenian Apostolic Church has created this brotherhood, Armenian
Yahparak Tachun.
Bayrak Tuchun, or brotherhood,
Yeah.
as a way of combating the evangelicals' influence or diminishing their influence. In other words, they're doing what the evangelicals have done since their inception.
Mhm.
Now they have these groups of people.
Mhm.
They meet in the homes of different, each week they meet in the home of a different member. They sing hymns, charagans, they pray, study the Bible together, and then share a meal together. I have a relative, a cousin, who lives in Fresno. She's a member of this Armenian Orthodox Brotherhood. And she says sometimes they meet in her home and sometimes in other homes. So they have imitated the practices of the Armenian evangelicals. Like the Armenian evangelicals were in favor of having the Bible translated into modern Armenian.
Mhm.
175 years ago, the Armenian Apostolic Church was opposed to this.
Yeah.
Now they're not. Now they have translated the Armenian Bible into modern Armenian, not classical Armenian.
Mhm.
In many churches, apostolic churches in America, the Gospels are read in modern Armenian, not in the classical Armenian. In others, they still read them in the classical Armenian, which nobody understands, or very few people understand.
Mm.
The Armenian evangelicals had a school attached to every church. Every Armenian evangelical church in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, in Cilicia, had a school attached to it.
Mm.
Now, the Armenian apostolics have done the same.
Yeah.
The Armenian evangelicals had midweek prayer meetings,
Mhm.
Bible study prayer meetings. Now the apostolics have done the same thing. The Armenian evangelicals had the pledge system to fund the operation of their schools and churches.
Mm.
The Armenian apostolics have done the same today. The Armenian evangelicals demanded that their clergy have high education before they are considered for ordination.
Mhm.
The Armenian Apostolic Church in those days did not put a premium on high education. They had highly educated clergy, but they also had uneducated clergymen.
Mm.
People were ordained as priests simply because they had a good voice, they could sing well, and they were ordained as priests because of their melodious voice. Now they don't do that. Now they are demanding high education. Before a candidate is ordained a priest, he should have graduated from a seminary or a college or a university. They should have higher education. Otherwise, they don't qualify. So they have followed what evangelical Armenians have done since their inception.
Yes.
And at one time, I know an Armenian bishop here in the United States told me,
Mm.
we learned many things from you.
That's good. They admit it. I join the apostolic Yahparak Tachun every morning in Kuwait. They have it. I joined them, but then it was about the lukewarm. Jesus wants us to be either hot or cold, about lukewarm. And there was one speaker, and I was saying, like apostolic church, it's weird, like they light candles. And Arshak Yahpar, Arshak? The daughter is Never Sepilian. Never Sepilian, she leads this woman's Bible study. When I said after that, she was so upset. She said, you should not talk about apostolic church. She was upset at me because I was downgrading. I said, I am an apostolic. I got married in apostolic church. I was baptized there. But if something is wrong, it's wrong. We have to say that. It's just,
Well, in conclusion, I remembered something about Daniel chapter 2.
Uh,
There are some theologians today, Bible interpreters, who believe that Nebuchadnezzar uh, had not forgotten his dream.
mhm,
He was a clever man, intelligent person. He knew that those astrologers in the palace were drawing a salary that they didn't deserve. He knew that they told lies. They had no ability to predict future events. So to trap them, he came up with this ingenious plan. I saw a dream, but I forgot it. I can't remember it.
mhm,
Now, if you are revealers of future events, tell me about the dream.
mhm,
Tell me what I saw in my dream and then interpret it for me.
mhm,
So he put them to the test and they failed. That's also a possible interpretation. It's an interpretation that I can accept. Um, either way, you see the hand of God in all these events,
Do
the
you think-
succession of these empires, how no one believed that Cyrus the Great could defeat Babylon. Nobody believed that Cyrus the Great could divert the flow of the river Euphrates, but he did. Uh, it's interesting what happened. By the way, Cyrus the Great, he was the most humane emperor of ancient times. He was way ahead of his time. Archaeologists have discovered a stone, a slab of stone. It's called the Cyrus Stele, Steele. It's a stone, a piece of slab with cuneiform writing, and Cyrus the Great says, all the nations that had been subjugated by the Babylonians were to be set free.
Mhm.
And he set them free, including the Jews. He told the Jews that had been exiled to Babylon, they could return to their home country and rebuild their temple and city. And he gave them money from his own treasury to rebuild their city and temple. So he was a very humane person. He didn't want to keep the exiles as prisoners and hostages. He wanted to free everyone. So he was way ahead of his time. He was a very humane, compassionate person.
There's a nice prophecy.
Was it Cyrus sent Nehemiah to build the walls? Was it Cyrus?
Cyrus was the one who issued the decree of emancipation, but most of the Jews started migrating from Babylon to Jerusalem during the reign of King Artaxerxes,
Yeah.
which was a later date. Yeah, but Cyrus was the one who issued the decree, and then his successor, Darius, reinstated the same decree.
Darius.
Darius, and then Artaxerxes reinstated again the decrees of Darius and Cyrus. But Cyrus was the one who kept the ball running, who came with the idea, and then his successors honored his wish.
The decree, what
Many
was
of the Jews, had settled in Babylon. They were comfortable. They had built homes, started businesses, and they didn't want to leave. It was Nehemiah and Ezra who convinced them to return.
what was
And
the
again, not all of them returned. A sizable group of Jews remained in Babylon.
Yeah. I don't know what happened in Iraq. They had to leave the Israelite. Something happened. I don't remember. I was young.
Because of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
Oh,
In
1940.
1948, the first Arab-Israeli War, what happened, the Israelis expelled 1.5 million Palestinians, and they seized their properties, their homes, villages, businesses. And then the Arab nations retaliated by kicking out the Jews and seizing their properties.
Yeah.
So the Jews who lived in Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, Damascus, they were all expelled and their properties were seized in retaliation for what the Israelis had done to the Palestinians. That's why the Jews left Iraq. They
Yeah.
did not leave of their own free will. They were expelled.
Yes. What was the decree? The decree, you said, what was the decree that Cyrus gave? What was the decree?
That all captive nations be returned, be freed.
Oh,
And this decree was inscribed on a slab. It's now at the London Museum, and it's called the Cyrus Stele. Stele is spelled S-T-E-E-L-E. Stele means a piece of stone.
S-T-E-E-L-E.
Okay. The Cyrus Stele is a very important historical artifact today.
I see.
Most civil rights defenders refer to it. Okay. Well, nice seeing you. Have a pleasant weekend. We'll see you next week.
Lord willing.
We'll study Daniel chapter 7.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bodville.
Thank
God
you.
bless you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.